order. Welcome to our members. I hope you all have had a positive summer and are well rested and ready to deal with some challenging issues that are facing our country at the moment. Welcome to meeting number 2 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Welcome to our analysts who consistently cover off of our meetings and do our reports. Very much appreciated. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on June 16, 2025, the committee is commencing its study of Canada's engagement in a rules-based international trade and investment system. Regrettably, we are missing Mr. Herman, did not have the proper connection for his headset, so will not be appearing before us today, but he will be invited to come possibly Monday or at the first opportunity that he can. From Attack Quebec on video conference is Claude Vaillancourt. And here in the room with us from the Canadian Pork Council is Renee Roy, the chair, Stephen Heckberg, the executive director, people who are familiar with our committee, and we are familiar with you for the most part. And from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, Brian Kingston, President and Chief Executive Officer, and Jennifer Steeves, Director, Industry and Consumer Affairs. Thank you all very much for making time to be here today to start us off on our current study. We will start with opening remarks and rounds of questions. So, Mr. Kingston, if you would like to start off with 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Madam Chair, honourable members, I appreciate the invite to be here today as part of your study on Canada's engagement in a rules-based international trade and investment system. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers, CVMA, is the industry association that represents Canada's leading manufacturers of light and heavy-duty motor vehicles. Our membership includes Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis FCA Canada. As a trading nation, the rules-based international trade and investment system is foundational to the success of the economy. Two-way trade in goods and services accounted for 67% of GDP in 2023. In the automotive industry, 90% of Canadian production is exported. Rules-based trade policies and regulatory harmonization created the integrated North American market, whereby Canadian manufacturers sell into a broader North American market, accounting for annual sales of 20 million vehicles. It is this integration that has allowed Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis to make historic job-creating investments in Canada over the past 5 years that are totaling nearly $15 billion. The CVMA has consistently advocated for Canada to pursue a rules-based trade and investment system that adheres to the following 5 principles. Number 1, there be no differentiated outcomes between Canada and the U.S. with respect to automotive trade. 2, that trade rules support the deep integration of the North American integrated automotive industry. 3, rules of origin that fully consider and align with our strong dependence on sourcing within North America. 4, currency disciplines to ensure that market access provisions in our trade agreements are not undermined by currency manipulation. And 5, the removal of all non-tariff barriers such as unique regulations or taxes that impede free trade. China does not adhere to many of the rules-based trade and investment principles that have been fundamental to the success of the auto industry and the Canadian economy. The CVMA strongly supports the China surtax order that placed a 100% tariff on Chinese EV imports, and we have asked the government to maintain it. The economic and national security concerns that prompted the government to implement the surtax in the first place remain the same today. There is simply too much at stake for the auto industry and the broader Canadian economy if this surtax were to be removed. The playing field must be level and rules-based if Canada's auto industry is to compete with China's EV industry. In markets around the world where action was not taken quickly, Chinese EVs have rapidly gained market share and undermined the domestic automotive industry. The best example of this is Mexico. This year, 1 in 3 new cars sold will be built in China. That's up from 4% of the market in 2020. China has achieved this EV price advantage through a state-directed industrial policy that has provided subsidies totaling an estimated US $230 billion between 2009 and 2023. Combined with weak labor and environmental standards, and Chinese manufacturers can produce and sell EVs at a price point that is far below what a North American OEM could achieve. As documented extensively by Unifor, non-existent labor rights in China have suppressed wages and artificially lower the cost of production. According to an analysis of 30 Chinese auto companies, the hourly wage paid is anywhere between US $1.93 and US $4.27. Just to give you a sense of how that compares to CVMA members who are unionized, a production assembler there is paid an average hourly wage of $44.52 per hour and, of course, has generous pensions and benefits. In addition to a level playing field, we recommend the federal government eliminates the EV sales mandate known as the Electric Vehicle Availability Standard. This mandate prioritizes arbitrary EV sales targets over the development of the North American supply chain. This policy has opened Canada to subsidized or dumped EVs from China and other non-market economies. We recommend that this misguided EV sales mandate is scrapped in advance of the review of the CUSMA, our North American Free Trade Agreement. Thank you very much for the time, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roy, Mr. Heckbert, the two of you, if whoever wants to go first.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for this invitation, and thank you to members of the committee for the work that you're doing in this particular file. René Roy, I'm the President of the Canadian Pork Council, and accompanied by our Executive Director today, Mr. Stephen Higberg.
Exporter in the world. Free and fair trade policies are of the utmost importance to the prosperity and vitality of the Canadian pork industry. As you may know, Canada exports 70% of its pork production to almost 80 countries around the world. We are believers and supporters of free trade and fair trade in a rule-based system. That is why we are pleased to be consulted on this question. There have been many significant shocks in the international trading system. A rule-based system, notably science, evidence-based rule, is a remedy to such uncertainty and increase food security for the world. In our view, Canada must remain a strong advocate for a rule-based international trade and investment system, but we must also demand the same from our trading partners. For example, we have TRQ with Great Britain as part of our ongoing effort to increase trade with that country. But rules that related to animal production and processing in the UK has put place prevent us processing in the UK has put it that the UK has put in place prevent us from accessing this market. Those rules are not science-based, nor they are reciprocated from a Canadian perspective. In other cases, like CETA, the pork industry does not view that agreement positive because of technical barrier to trades. We estimate that the pork sector alone is losing a market opportunity of about $400 million annually. That is why we urge the committee to be vigilant, to ensure the science-based principle that govern our trade and that it is protected. All the long-term projection for global demand for pork paints a picture of growth well into the future. Canada's ability to provide quality pork to the rest of the world will be part of our contribution to the growth of Canada's economy. Where we could benefit from help from this Parliament is in the effort to expand our processing capability in Canada, whether that from existing processors expanding their capacity, or it is from encouraging new entrants into the industry from overseas for Canada pork production to grow. We must also grow processing capacity, and so effort to seek foreign direct investment in agri-food facilities is something we invite this committee to explore. Nous espérons que le comité continuera à s'assurer que la
We hope that the committee will continue to ensure that food security remains a key part of our strategy when you review this file, and also all files to do with your mandate. Thank you, and we'd be delighted to respond to your questions.
And Mr. Vaillancourt, see you on the screen, please. The floor is yours for up to 5 minutes. Mute yourself, sir.
Bonjour. Nous tenons.
Yes. We'd like to thank you for this invitation. Attaque Québec, which is a citizen action for fiscal, social and environmental justice, aims, among other things, to restore democratic control over financial markets and their institutions. I'm the president of the association and responsible for the free trade file. I've been interested in this issue for over 20 years and have written and coordinated 3 books on the topic. We believe that rules-based international trade is fundamental. However, we must ask ourselves, what are these rules and who benefits from them? Since the 1990s, the rules that have been put in place have not really served the interests of people around the world. The rules have been written into free trade agreements negotiated in secret without sufficient consultation with civil society actors, and have been designed to benefit large transnational corporations, often to shield them from other rules they should have followed, those requiring them to pay their taxes, protect the environment, and provide decent work. As a result, the track record of years of free trade, in light of the rules enshrined in free trade agreements, is not a pretty one. Widening inequality, competition between workers resulting in job losses, a significant decline in the purchasing power of the middle class and the most disadvantaged in society, major environmental degradation, and weak economic growth. Faced with a significant drop in their quality of life, many voters are turning to far-right parties that feed on the resulting dissatisfaction. Too many people feel left by the wayside and powerless. Donald Trump was elected, particularly in his first term, by winning the majority of votes in regions devastated by the consequences of free trade agreements, an evil he did not hesitate to name and capitalize on. Re-elected, Trump refuses to comply with the rules that led to such results, preferring to enforce his own rules, which are even more disastrous. This leaves his main economic partners bewildered. Faced with the erratic tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, and above all with his intimidating negotiating style, Canada must stick to its fundamental values, refuse to make any concessions in advance, and firmly offer a counterexample in terms of negotiations. By breaking the rules, Trump is achieving more in a few weeks than other countries have achieved after years of negotiations. The worst attitude to take is to give in to him in advance. For example, the hasty abandonment of the digital services tax, which we believe is essential, has done much more harm than good, and it's done nothing to change the attitude of the President of the United States. Canada must adopt a stance towards Donald Trump that allows it to fully uphold its beliefs, rather than giving in to the contagion effect of the most questionable measures taken by the US government. It must develop rules that enable it to better protect the environment and take action on climate justice. Canada must maintain supply management in its entirety. It must protect culture and reaffirm its commitments to the principle of cultural sovereignty. It must also break with rules that have been harmful, such as investor-state dispute settlement, as Canada did in CUSMA, or regulatory cooperation, quote-unquote, terms that often allow necessary regulations to be quietly undermined. The Canadian government must resist any weakening of health and safety rules. Canada should apply all of this in its ongoing negotiations with Ecuador, Mercosur, and Indonesia. Admittedly, the behaviour of our southern neighbour is particularly unpredictable, to the point that even when the most solid agreements, such as CUSMA, are under threat. But the worst attitude is to give in to intimidation and bullying, to commit our future to the wishes of an extremist president who has little support from his own people and who will not be in office forever. So I'd be delighted to respond to your questions, of course.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the witnesses for those opening statements. We will now open the floor for questions from our members. Mr. Chambers for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to welcome all the witnesses here for this first meeting of a very important study and for your opening testimony. I'd like to start with Mr. Kingston for a couple minutes, if I might. I just heard you mention a couple stats. I just want to make sure I got them right. Did I hear you correctly? 90% of Canadian vehicles made in Canada today are exported?
Yeah, approximately 90% is where it's been historically.
Okay. I assume most of those are going to the United States?
That's correct.
Do any of them go to China?
No.
Okay.
No, it would be minuscule and probably non-existent.
Right. For a whole bunch of reasons, but really, they wouldn't even be allowed to go to China, right?
No, due to tariffs, vehicle standards, divergence in regulations, it would not. That would not make sense or be possible.
Right. And so I read in today's Globe and Mail, I think an opinion piece authored by Clean Energy Canada. I'm not sure if you're aware of that organization.
I
Right.
am. Yeah.
You know, they're suggesting that Canada opens its doors to electric vehicles coming from Europe, but in reality, I think they're actually coming through Europe, but from China. Is that your understanding?
Yes, I've had a glance at the report. My understanding is the vehicles that were included in it, a number of them were coming from China to Europe and then proposing they come to Canada.
Okay. And do you know, like, who funds Clean Energy Canada? Like, who's behind that? I mean, you disclosed who your members are. Do you know who the members of Clean Energy Canada are?
I do not, and I've wondered because they've been very adamant that Chinese vehicles come into the Canadian market, but it's not clear to me. There's no transparency around who funds them.
Okay, so Canadians really are being asked, or the government's being asked on behalf of Canadians to effectively allow vehicles from a country that won't allow our vehicles to go there so that they could displace vehicles that in theory are built here. Is that what your understanding is?
That is my understanding of the ask, yes.
Okay. And you mentioned the electric vehicle mandate, and I got to say, you've been very famous. You've been on TV a number of times. You've been giving interviews, and I saw an interview you did a couple weeks ago with on CBC actually with David Cochrane, and I think you mentioned there are currently Canadian auto manufacturers. They've already purchased credits from Tesla under the government scheme. Is that correct?
Yes, according to our estimates, there is a deficit of EV sales between now and 2030 of about 550,000. So that's compared to the government mandated targets. So to manage that deficit, companies have to contract with automakers that have surplus EV sales. And that would be anywhere, as we get towards 2030, the number could be as high as $3.6 billion. But according to our estimates, over $1 billion has already been committed to this.
So over $1 billion from the industry committed to purchasing credits. Is that what I understand?
That is correct.
And currently, there's only one seller of credits. Is that not correct?
There's one company that would have surplus credits that only produces electric vehicles and would be in a position to sell, yes.
Okay. And is that $1 billion number money that has already gone to Tesla, or is that money that is committed to go?
So I can't tell you how much would have already gone. It's committed to a multi-year contract that you could effectively option these credits as required over the coming years. But the current gap right now between the mandated sales level by the federal government and the current sales level, we're at 7.7%. We have to get to 60% sales by 2030. There is no way to close that gap without significant credit purchases. So while it's an option, companies will have to go down that road.
Okay. And is that $1 billion just for your members or for the entire sector together?
That's an estimate of the entire sector based on the gap.
Okay, so that would also include other manufacturers that are not currently in your organization. Okay, that's very helpful. I had heard that hundreds of millions of dollars have already gone to Tesla. Cash has gone to purchase credits by one manufacturer, would that be your understanding that, would you ballpark like how much you think cash has already gone to Tesla shareholders? Like, do you have an idea?
Well, given that we're already in the 2026 model year and the gap is so significant, I think it's safe to say that hundreds of millions would have already been exercised, but I can't give you an exact figure.
Right. So the Canadian government electric vehicle policy, just so I understand, the result is that Canadian auto manufacturers, the domestics that you represent, plus the ones from overseas that came here and invested billions of dollars in property, plant, and equipment, they have to send cash to a foreign automaker who has no manufacturing footprint in Canada and has no intention of having a manufacturing footprint in Canada. Is that how I understand it?
That is correct.
Okay.
20 seconds remaining.
Madam Chair, I'll yield my time to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kingston.
Napke, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today and, as my colleague mentioned, in helping us undertake, as we start this new parliament, new committee, a very important fundamental question around the impact, and I like to think positive impact of the rules-based trading system and why it's been important for Canadian economy, and so really appreciate different sectors being here. And I will start my line of questioning with Mr. Kingston again. For us who have known for some time and maybe testing you some skill back to times when you and I were doing our graduate work in international trade policy. You were not big famous then at that time, but I knew you will be one day, so I'm glad that you are here. Look, I think Canadian auto sector is a great example of a rules-based trading system. I think the existence of manufacturing of automobiles in Canada is a result of that. Can you help us sort of trace back time when we did not manufacture cars in Canada, and how did that industry go about, and maybe touch upon the Auto Pact and the unique features around that, please?
Yeah, so the auto industry has been building cars and employing Canadians for 125 years. And if you go back to the foundation of the industry, we used to, of course, have significant trade barriers. And so manufacturers would put a facility here to overcome that barrier and build in market. And then over time, as we got to the Auto Pact in the 60s, it was recognized that this is deeply inefficient. If we actually got rid of tariffs and created an integrated North American market, you could lower the cost of production, you could build a vehicle for one North American market and move it back and forth across the border. And so that's what happened in the 60s, where we started to remove those barriers and encourage that supply chain. And the result is, and we reference this stat regularly, but a part or a component can cross the Canada-US or US-Mexico border 7 or 8 times before it's installed in a finished vehicle. That has been the foundation of the success of this sector. It's currently under challenge because of US 232 tariffs on the industry. But rules-based trade and open trade has enabled this industry to thrive in Canada.
And Auto Pact, to my memory, was signed in 1965? 65,
yeah.
Right? So, and one could perhaps argue that was the genesis of, in fact, the free trade agreement, and then NAFTA, and then CUSMA that we entered with U.S. Is that your impression as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, autos were at the center of trade discussions between Canada and the U.S. going back 60 years.
So really, I mean, probably behooves us all that we're sort of finding ourselves at a point where we've demonstrated the success of a rules-based trading system, breaking down barriers, reducing tariffs, helping manufacturing and creating good-paying jobs in both American and Canadian jurisdictions, and now we're going back to sort of erecting those barriers again. But there has been challenges as well, and to me, the dispute resolution mechanism of these rules-based trading system is another very important feature. Can you talk about some of the challenges even with the existing free trade that we've had with the U.S., some of the key challenges in manufacturing and how those agreements have assisted Canadian auto manufacturers?
Yes. First of all, dispute settlement mechanisms are critical components of trade agreements because it does give you that avenue when you have a disagreement. And we have had challenges. With the CUSMA agreement, there's been a dispute with our American partners over the what's called the Supercore roll-up, which is a unique component of the rules of origin. And Canada and Mexico won that case, but the U.S. did not comply with the ruling. So we have had challenges. We also had a side letter in CUSMA on Section 232 tariffs that exempts Canadian production up to 2.6 million vehicles from any future U.S. tariff actions, and that has not been adhered to. So these are critically important parts of agreements, but of course all parties have to agree to implement them, and we've had some challenges recently, which has resulted in this current situation.
And how has these agreements have helped Canada attract other manufacturers outside the typical North American car companies we may consider, especially from Japan and other countries, to set up shop here and create employment here in Canada?
Investment attraction because Canada is a relatively small market in its own right, about 1.8 to 1.9 million new vehicles sold every year. So you wouldn't necessarily put a plant in Canada just to sell to Canadians. You do it because you have access through NAFTA and now CUSMA to the broader U.S. market and Mexico, 20 million annual vehicle sales. So that's been fundamental. Without that access, the case to put a plant in Canada that can produce 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 vehicles a year, it becomes a little challenging.
So fair to say that free trade agreements has been critical to job growth, to competitiveness, and in fact innovation as well in the Canadian auto manufacturing sector.
Fundamental. It's the foundation of the industry.
Thank you.
Monsieur Sabard-Tremblay.
Madame la Présidente, merci à
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, and thank you to all the witnesses in attendance today. Thank you for your presentations. I find that quite interesting. There have been a number of groups that have been talking about the realities in their specific markets, their perspectives and their troubles and difficulties. Now, Mr. Vaillancourt, I understand that you're dealing with the architecture of the situation. How can you take advantage of the actual current crisis, not just to redefine things and put them back in place as they were previously, but how to overhaul the current system in place? I imagine that that's what you were kind of getting at. Response: yes, we are talking about a rules-based system. How do we deal with these rules? What rules do we choose, and who do these rules serve? Well, let me start with a question in that case. It's a bit of an opportunistic one. The Bloc Québécois tabled legislation this very morning to ensure that there's greater transparency in free trade agreements, in all international free trade agreements, that they be tabled transparently and subject to a time frame before they're voted on so that we can sink our teeth into them, and they can't be signed off in secret, because we've seen this occur before. These trade agreements that have been signed off on in secret without them being the subject of a debate in the public sphere. So we'd like to be able to scrutinise them and then vote on them, and also not just look in committee at an implementation bill, but on the actual agreements themselves. Would you support such an idea? Response: yes, we would, 100%. And what we've been criticising for many years is the dearth of transparency in free trade agreements, particularly when it comes to negotiations. Oftentimes, information is provided to us in a piecemeal fashion. Moreover, a dearth of transparency because there's a refusal to consult certain advocacy groups in the population. For example, the union movement that hasn't been adequately consulted when it comes to free trade agreements. And in fact, when it comes time to ratify a free trade agreement, oftentimes the deadlines are far too tight. Let me give you an example. When the agreement between Canada and Europe was ratified by the Canadian Parliament, it happened at breakneck speed, without there being any fulsome debate on the issue, as if it was a fait accompli that we were faced with. So indeed, I think we need to give civil society actors enough time to scrutinise these agreements and give input, because perhaps there are elements that won't suit all actors, and this is precisely what has happened on multiple occasions in the past. So any openness to greater transparency, that would address our expectations as civil society organisations that are working on these free trade agreements. That's crucial when it comes to democracy as well. Question. Well, you're talking about transparency vis-à-vis the public and also parliamentarians. Now, previously in this committee, we had to study an agreement without even having the text at our disposal, which is completely nonsensical. Now, Canada is a federated entity, and there are provinces, even though I don't like the term, Quebec is recognised as a distinct nation. Do you think that Quebec, for example, and other legislatures across Canada should have greater input? Response. Well, indeed, when CETA was negotiated, Quebec did engage, but the chief negotiator at the time, and I'm quoting him from memory, he said that both in the corridors and around the negotiation table, that input was limited. And yet we know that the province's jurisdiction is healthcare, education, culture. These are important spheres and domains, and those are often the subject of free trade negotiations. So in that respect, I do agree that the provinces should take up their rightful place in free trade agreement negotiations. Question. Well, for example, when it came to the CETA negotiations, it's a far cry from Wallonie, for example, that has a veto power in terms of what Belgium can do in their agreements. Yes, in fact, they did slow down the negotiations by putting forward a series of negotiations of misgivings that were voiced by a number of civil society actors and unions. They were the opposition that was highly articulated, I should add. And Paul Magnette, at the time, his rhetoric was formidable, remarkable, very fleshed out, very fulsome, very well argued, and I think that we know that the current level of instability geopolitically, and we've seen how certain politicians have capitalised on that very instability in order to put in place policies that fly in the face of the interests of the populations of these countries. Well, 20 seconds. I don't have time for a question, a fully fledged question, and let alone allow you to respond fulsomely. So next time round.
Mr. Groulx, please, for 5 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues.
Madam Chair, colleagues, thank you very much for being here, guests, so that we can support and develop the Canadian economy. My question will be for Mr. Roy, Canadian Pork Council. Thanks for coming here today from the most beautiful region in Canada to come here to Ottawa. And obviously I'm talking about the Beauce. Thank you very much, Mr. Roy. Now, Mr. Roy, earlier you talked about $400 million worth of opportunities. You want to export more pork globally, and evidently the Conservatives want to support you in that effort. Now, earlier you referred to this. What are the markets that the pork sector can exploit and that have great potential for the sector, and for what reasons? Response. Well, inaudible for the interpreter. Microphone, please.
On va commencer par les pays dans lesquels...
So, we'll start in the countries where we have a presence, can have a greater presence. Southeast Asia is a region with tremendous potential. There's a very young population that is eating more and more meat, particularly red meat, and it's a marketplace that we have our sights on, in which we're already active. Now, there are markets such as the European Union where there's strong potential, particularly value-added products. However, we have limited access despite the fact that we have CETA, our free trade agreement with Europe, and yet we don't have access to the European markets adequately. Question. There's CETA, obviously, which is in place. How is it that you can't export to your liking? Well, mainly because of technical barriers to trade. There's theoretical openness towards meeting certain quotas that can be negotiated, but there are a number of barriers. In the media recently, we've heard a lot about deforestation. And if there is deforestation in a particular country, and that's been empirically demonstrated, they can't export to the European Union. These are technical and arbitrary rules that prevent exporting countries that would otherwise have access to Europe's marketplace to export. Question, do you get the sense that the federal government is adequately consulting the pork sector when trade priorities and international priorities are being developed? And if not, in fact, how should that process be improved? Response. Well, the issue that we have is that the process, of course, needs to be very open. And the agri-foods industry has its particularities, and evidently we must be consulted. But also in the fine print of the free trade agreements, that's where we face a number of challenges. And in my opening remarks, we alluded to Great Britain, which requires, under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, very specific compliance when it comes to production and processing, which really shouldn't be there, and which are deliberately there, it's quite evident, are deliberately there to prevent Canadian and North American products from having access to their markets when they have access to ours. Well, thank you very much. We'll come back to you in the second round. Mr. Hua, the Prime Minister gave an undertaking to Canadians to remove inter-provincial barriers. Now, have these barriers been removed in the pork sector? That's my question. Well, in our sector, pork, we have access to all the slaughterhouses. And I have to be very careful with my choice of words here. This is quite technical. All of those slaughterhouses that are expected by the CFIA, they can trade meat domestically and abroad. However, those that have a provincial inspection licence, they face constraints for the most part and have to trade within their particular provinces. And the proposal that we made to the federal government is that were those markets to be opened up for those that are inspected at a provincial level, that there be greater harmonisation. Otherwise, it will hinder consumers' trust if there are issues, because we know that the standards from one province to another vary substantially. I'll come back to you later. Thank you.
Seka, please, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to go a little further back than PS NACV in terms of where trade all started here with Canada. We really started at the beginning of Canada, and that was with our fur trade. We'll jump to 1965, as we heard with the Auto Pact, and we continue to be a trading nation. You know, Canada is 0.5% of the world's population, but we make up 2.5% of the world's trade. So we punch well above our weight. And that is because we have always looked out towards trade. We see it as an opportunity for growth, but also for our workers, for our businesses. But the way that we do it has always been one around trade, but fair trade. And the agreements that we've looked to set up, I had the opportunity to sit on this International Trade Committee back in 2015 as we were going through the renegotiations of the NAFTA, that became the new NAFTA, or the CUSMA, as we call it today, or the Comprehensive Pacific Trade Partnership, the CPTPP, that we have, and as well as CETA with Europe. And within those agreements, and this speaks also to Monsieur Vaillancourt, we always wanted to bring in those elements of a level playing field. That when it came to labor standards, environmental standards, et cetera, I know this speaks well to how Mr. Kingston feels and his association. So when we saw that we needed much more diversification, that's why we set up those agreements. In 2018, we set a target. This was through Global Affairs Canada. The target was to increase our exports to markets other than the United States by 50% by 2025. Well, we achieved that stretch goal by 2024. We hit that target of 50%. A lot in part to groups like the Pork Council. So the Pork Council has done an outstanding job. Actually, some of the members here of this committee, yesterday we were, Madam Chair was there, and PS, and I know Mr. Chambers, MP Chambers, a number of others were there. We were at the Indo-Pacific meeting for the heads of mission. And Ambassador for Japan, Ambassador Yamanouchi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, raved about Canadian pork and how they can get more Canadian pork and what we could do for those exports. So through these agreements that we've had, and to achieve what we've been able to achieve, this 50% increase, I want to know, take us through what was put into those agreements that allowed an industry like the pork industry to be able to expand so much and to be able to export. As I heard, 70% of our product here is exported.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. The pork industry in general has been really proactive into trade, notably in Japan. And I will use the example of Japan to exemplify what you were mentioning. The fact that we have science-based rules, it allows us to have a common language. And once we have this common language, we can easily solve challenges because we are speaking the same language. A good example is we have an office of CFIA into Japan, and the fact that we have people on the ground there, it helps a lot to make sure that we are able to communicate and also find solutions when there are technical challenges. And this success is clear today. It is now, in terms of value, Japan is our first export market in the world, in front of the United States, which has never been seen before. Just to give you how successful we are by implementing science-based rules. We have heard about the challenge of budget. For sure, these kind of office, for CFIA office, they are important for us. They are a stepping stone to promote how we do business with the rest of the world.
Merci. Do I have some time? 30 seconds. I don't know if there'll be 30 seconds here. It is to Mr. Kingston. As you know, as we get into the review of CUSMA, just wanted to see what your thoughts are. Where are the opportunities? Where are some of those threats, risks that as we go into this review?
The objective has to be achieving certainty, because uncertainty right now is killing the Canadian business community, because we don't know what the rules of the game will be. So I think the objective has to be to renew the deal and give the economy certainty that this will continue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, alors, Monsieur
Well, Mr. Vaillancourt, we were talking about the international rules-based trade, and we were discussing who benefits from the rules, how they're established, and what the outcomes are. Now, if you had to single out a couple of trade agreements that need to be overhauled or completely replaced wholesale, which ones would they be? Response. Over all of these years of free trade, there are two major defects that don't seem to be factored in. First rule is the protection of the environment needs to be far more significant than it currently is. However, the trend among governments is to give up economic protection on economic pretexts, which augurs very badly, given that the environment should be a top priority. Second thing, free trade rules haven't helped to reduce the widening of inequality. And fiscality or tax issues are completely excluded in these free trade agreements, when that directly impacts trade competitiveness between nations. That's highly problematic to our mind, and it heightens inequality societally, and we simply cannot get a handle on that. Question. Well, what about were we to emulate the minimum tax, corporate tax of the OECD? Well, it's clearly inadequate. 15%. Honestly, it's woefully inadequate. And there are a whole lot of loopholes as well in that agreement. It's highly complex. It was full of good intentions, but in practice, it hasn't played out as we would have liked. Of course, it's better than nothing. And unfortunately, President Trump has lobbied to delete that agreement entirely. But that said, aspirationally, it was a good thing. It's discouraging for all of those stakeholders who are working on social justice, have been doing so for years, because it seems like we are in a retrograde situation when in our civilization we should be making significant advances.
Yes, Mr. Mantle. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to have start some questions with Mr. Kingston. Mr. Kingston, I think I heard you correctly, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that one of your outcomes or desires is for no differentiated outcomes for auto trade between Canada and the U.S. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. Given the integration, we've always tried to have the same access as the U.S. would have.
And right now, is that the case?
No. The U.S. has been very active, both putting up tariffs but also negotiating bilateral agreements with other markets. So that objective is becoming a little more challenging to achieve.
So in the situation where we have right now, that would be a failure, in your opinion. We don't want to stay where we are right now.
No, the one area that is positive, though, is on the China surtax. The fact that Canada matched the U.S. action, that was necessary and must be maintained.
Thanks. I'll get to that in a moment. What can you tell us a little bit about the current economic impact of the U.S. tariffs on Canadian autos to our auto industry?
Significant. Right now, through the first and second quarters of 2025, automakers have reported a total of $12 billion in tariff costs. So that makes it extremely challenging to continue to produce at the levels that traditionally automakers have produced here. So if this persists, it could have an impact on jobs, production. It's extremely damaging.
So in a worst case scenario where there's no deal, no larger deal, whether that's CUSMA or something else, and there's no sectoral deal with respect to autos, what happens to the industry?
A worst case scenario is that we go back to a pre-auto pact environment where effectively you have to produce in Canada to access the Canadian market. And that's what the federal government has set up, what's called a performance-based permission framework, which effectively puts that in place. So that is where things would go. You would have a far less efficient industry that is focused solely on Canada, and the same thing would take place in the United States.
Do you think under that situation the auto industry in Canada is viable?
It would be viable, but it's hard to see a scenario where it's as productive, as large, as big of a footprint.
So in that situation, we'd see job losses, loss of investment in the Canadian sector?
Highly likely, because the whole objective of being here in Canada is that you can sell into that 20 million vehicle market. If we go down the road of a fractured North American market, you'd be here producing for a total customer base of 1.8 to 1.9 million Canadians. So it's not as efficient.
Okay, and that's worst case scenario.
It's worst case scenario.
So let's move a little bit from worst case. Say let's go to a middle ground scenario where we end up with some level of tariffs, U.S. tariffs on Canadian autos. How does that affect the industry?
It makes it very hard to attract new investments and to expand the footprint here. We can hold on to what we have, but it will be costly to manufacture in Canada, even at a low tariff rate, just because of the volume of production. So ultimately, this means higher prices, not just for Canadians, but for Americans. When you go to purchase a new vehicle, we've seen estimates of price increases of $4,000 to $12,000. It means less production, and it means less jobs.
So if we get no deal and we have some level of tariffs on the Canadian auto sector, does that mean we will see job losses in our auto sector?
It depends on the tariff level, but it is hard to produce at the levels that we have historically produced at if we are facing tariffs on Canadian production.
So if we're producing less cars in Ontario, we need less workers to produce those cars.
That's correct.
So, okay. So that sounds like job losses to me.
Worst case scenario.
Okay. Do you think it's important that the EV mandate be dropped immediately before we get into any negotiation with the United States?
Yes, it absolutely needs to be dropped for a couple of reasons. First, there's the economic reasons that we've discussed. The industry is under extreme pressure. A federal mandate that puts billions of dollars of cost on Canadian manufacturers makes absolutely no sense. Secondly, we need to work with the United States in this transition to electrification. We've won huge investments into Canada. Canada has a role to play in electrification. To have these extremely divergent policies, it does not make sense.
Thanks. One last question. I understand there's been billions in U.S. tariff costs already paid. Have you received any of that back in remissions?
That is a good question. There have been remissions through the supply chain on some of the inputs. So, for example, some of the steel inputs and so on. So I understand that, yes, remissions have been received there. And automakers are not currently paying tariff on vehicles they bring in from the U.S. because of the performance-based remission framework.
Thank you. Ms. Lapointe, please, for 5 minutes.
Alors, bonjour, Monsieur Roy.
Yes, Mr. Roy. I direct my questions to you, please. Steve Leroy. And I'm sorry to disappoint Mr. Rouleau, but I'm from the most beautiful region in Quebec, the Bas du Fleuve, and I'm the son of a farmer in the pork sector, in fact. And this is of great interest to me, what you've been saying. And I'd like to ask you a bunch of rapid-fire questions, if I may, by way of context. I get the sense that pork production has experienced difficulty for the past 15, 20 years, or has it been over 30 years? Response. Well, it's an open marketplace. In an open market, there are periods that are strong, and then there are tougher times. Now, when there are disturbances, you want quick answers, so I'll try and be concise, but when there are disturbances in the economic framework, that has an impact on products such as pork, for example. Well, you've talked about the cyclical nature, but what about strategy? You have a strategy in place, a new one. Well, your website looks a bit old. You do have a new strategy. Okay, we're clear on that. I'm reassured to hear that. Because you talk at length about production and processing capacity. And we're talking about the issue of opening up new marketplaces. What are the three major obstacles that you face to growth and expanding to new markets? Now, obviously, you want greater capacity to produce and to process. But could you just explain how all this adds up so I can get a better handle on it? Response. Well, we're trying to get access to the best markets globally. In order to achieve that, we need to enjoy adequate capacity in our transformation plants to provide value added. That is one of our difficulties. We need enough workers, adequate infrastructure, adequate investment, in addition to the capacity, production capacity domestically in Canada. We also need stable international agreements, without which we are constantly exposed to issues like we're facing with the United States and free trade. I'll tack on to this line of questioning, if I may. Mr. Kingston, I'll ask you questions in French, if you can hear me and will follow. Now, I'm going to take issue with my two colleagues. The most beautiful region is Les Basses Laurentides, Lower Laurentians. Now, there's a particular area that I'm sure that you would be familiar with. We have Raufoss and Paccard. They produce aluminium parts. And I'd like to know whether that has had any impact, for example, rims. I believe that being exported abroad and that they also deal with companies in southern Ontario. Earlier, you spoke at length about Chinese EVs. What do you suggest that we do in order to combat the issue of Chinese EVs?
So first, we have to maintain the surtax on Chinese EVs. That is critical. That is what will allow this sector to. We're still in the early stages of the transition to electrification. We have to keep those vehicles out of the Canadian market. Secondly, we've got to align ourselves with the United States on the approach to China. Right now, the battery supply chain is controlled by China. This is all part of the Made in China 2025 industrial policy. We have an opportunity to be the supplier of choice in the Western Hemisphere for next generation battery materials, but we cannot do that if we allow ourselves to have our industry wiped out by a flood of dumped Chinese products. So those would be the steps that should be taken.
Ce que je comprends, vous souhaitez qu'on continue à...
So you'd like us to continue to invest in batteries to ensure that Chinese batteries don't enter Canada's marketplace and flood it.
This is one of the areas where we have a huge natural advantage. Canada is the only country in the Western Hemisphere with every mineral that goes into a next generation battery. Now, we haven't done a great job of getting those minerals out of the ground, but we know we have them. So if we can accelerate efforts to mine and process here, as other countries try and reduce dependence on China and the Chinese supply chain, we are perfectly positioned.
Merci
Thank you
beaucoup.
very much.
Merci.
Mr. McKenzie, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll reflect the thanks that other members of this committee have expressed to the witnesses for their time, both here in Ottawa and online. Mr. Kingston, to start with, I'm very curious about the position of Canada's partners. The close integration of our industry with the U.S. industry is not one of us and them, but all of us together. What are the reactions that you're hearing from Canada's partners across the border in the industry?
Well, yeah, there is deep concern with the tariff policy that's being pursued because it's putting cost on the automotive sector, and the sector has been historically integrated with Canada and Mexico. So there are efforts to try and find a way for an off-ramp here, an agreement, so that manufacturers can continue to build on a North American basis. We cannot compete globally if we're fighting amongst ourselves. And unfortunately, that's what's happening right now. So I remain optimistic that we'll find a solution, but it's challenging.
Is it fair to say that our U.S. partners in industry are suffering as much as Canadian industry is?
Absolutely. The costs that are being borne, yes, it's painful here in Canada. It's painful for Mexican manufacturing, but the U.S. industry is bearing these costs. And I think what originally the thinking was that this was all part of a strategy by the U.S. to put up tariffs and then negotiate deals, not permanent. So a lot of companies were basically eating the costs of these tariffs, not passing it through the supply chain. Now it's looking more like these are going to be medium to long-term tariffs. So companies will have no choice but to raise costs, and ultimately that means that you'll see less demand and lower production. So yes, this is causing damage everywhere.
And higher costs for vehicles.
Yes.
In both sides of the border, on both sides of the border in the North American marketplace.
There's no other outcome. Costs have to go up if companies will remain viable and deal with these tariff costs. So, we've seen estimates of $4,000 to $12,000 in price increases for a new vehicle if these policies stay in place.
And I have to believe those price increases are not very far away.
No. I think the hope had been that this would have been dealt with, and here we are, month 8 now, and the tariffs are still in place. So there will be no other option but to pass the costs on at some point.
Indeed, sir. I represent a riding in Western Canada, Calgary, Signal Hill. Can you tell me about participation from Western Canadian companies? We have a great deal of manufacturing capacity and capability in that part of the world. Participation in our auto industry, which I certainly understand is fundamentally headquartered here in Ontario and in Quebec.
Yes, well, the manufacturing base is largely historically in Ontario and somewhat in Quebec. Alberta has, first of all, a huge dealership network, and because of all of the resource development, a big market for work vehicles and pickup trucks. On top of that, Alberta has a number of the resources I was talking about, the minerals, huge mineral wealth. So there is great, particularly in rare earths, there are huge opportunities to expand Alberta's participation in the automotive supply chain.
Excellent. Thank you very much. If I could turn to Monsieur Roy. I believe I understood you suggest that encouragement of foreign direct investment in the processing industry would be helpful for your industry and your members. Could you expand on that and give us examples of what kind of encouragement the federal government might offer?
There is a challenge for putting in place additional capital, especially in this kind of business, having partnership with other companies around the world. Some are of significant size that could help us to have, for producers, to have also a more healthy market where there are more players, but also we would be able to supply through a good partnership, we would be able to supply additional market in the world.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Sort of, if I could add to that, in recent weeks, my chair and I were in Southeast Asia on a trade mission with the Minister of Agriculture, and these markets are tying food security to food availability in a much more direct way. You look at a market like Indonesia or Singapore or the Philippines, their production capacity isn't sufficient so that they can produce enough food to meet their own market demand. So they require access, frankly, to Canadian pork, among other commodities. And so when we talk about foreign direct investment, it's not that the foreign direct investment is required from a capital perspective in Canada. It is about building that linkage between a market like the Philippines, where there may well be a company from the Philippines interested in ensuring access to that product. And so the Philippine company's investment may well be tied to, if we have access to the Canadian product and we can therefore have a preferential treatment of the Philippines market, that's really what we're talking about in terms of that kind of foreign direct investment. We're not really seeking, overall, please come invest in Canada, but it is about targeting specific markets around the world where they would want more of our product in any case. Let's help them find ways of including that as a defense, as a food security question.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That indeed was a point for clarification. I was anticipating you were talking about capital being invested in Canada and processing facilities and so on.
Thank you very much, Mr. I'm sorry, like you're 50 seconds over, but
oh, I apologize. Thank you,
not
Chair.
a problem. I thought the answer was really important for us to see. So,
thank you,
Madame Lapointe.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Mr. Roy, yes, good afternoon. Now, earlier you talked about 70% of your production being exported. You referred to Japan as your biggest purchaser of exports, and 80 countries you alluded to. Which countries were you referred to? Europe, you referred to CETA, the Free Trade Agreement. You also touched on Southeast Asia. There's the Trans-Pacific Partnership in that neck of the woods. Do you face the same issues there as in terms of technical constraints in Europe? Excellent question. And the answer is no. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the comprehensive version, is based on international rules and also is science-based. So we don't face those issues there. And that means that we have much greater, more fluid trade in that area. What about Japan? What's the percentage of your exports to Japan vis-a-vis other exports? Good question. In terms of a percentage, it amounts to, if I do the math quickly, off the top of my head, 20-25%. I see. Well, there's Mercosur as well, Latin America. What are your thoughts about that? What can we do in terms of South America? What could we improve? In agri-foods, well, they're major producers in that sector. Their rules are different to ours. And our main issue is reciprocity, which is increasingly important. Otherwise, there'll be expectations that other countries will have that we won't be able to honour, because when they come to our borders, we won't permit those kinds of products to enter because of different rules. Thank you. I'll let you proceed. Mr. Roy, I'll come back to the questions I asked earlier in terms of processing and production. A two-pronged question. I already asked you this previously, but were you to identify the three major obstacles or barriers in your sector and the three best solutions to overcome those obstacles? You talked about processing, value added. That's all highly interesting. But what are the three major obstacles and the three best solutions to those obstacles? As producers, we need to send our products to processors. They, in turn, have to have access to global markets. It's all well and good to have domestic consumption, but it's clearly inadequate. And as a nation, well, we can export broadly. And the restrictions we face are in terms of investments, public or private. Well, they need to be together. You can't have an industry without domestic support from our domestic society. So it needs to be in tandem. Thereafter, you have to have rules, and we're talking about that today. Trade rules that are predictable, that are stable. Now, in terms of market diversification, we talked about food security earlier. We need to have access to numerous markets, and in those markets, there need to be solid, reliable agreements. Now, you're talking about rules in relation to Mr. Trump and our neighbour to the south. Is that the kind of predictability you're talking about? No, I'm not talking about that. Well, you're reassuring me on that point. Now, in terms of investments, what's preventing private investment at the moment? Is it... who's the dance partner that refuses to come to the party? Well, in terms of labour, we face a challenge, both in terms of production and processing. In order to achieve or reach out to different marketplaces, we need to have labour predictability, which is tough in these times. We also, and I'm talking about capital as well, if we are capable of investing, we need to have a long-term trajectory. And currently, that's something that's holding us back, that's preventing us from taking up our rightful place.
11 seconds left. I don't think you can get much done with that. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci. Alors, écoutez, j'étais le seul.
Well, thank you. I'm the only Quebec member who has said that he doesn't have or she doesn't have the best, most beautiful riding. So Saint-Pierre-Saint-Bagot, it's the most beautiful region, as well as Mr. Lavoie's region, because I actually come from that region, which is quite nice and holds a place in my heart. But Quebec is magnificent across the board, and that is why we have such a beautiful nation. And of course, we're not going to achieve consensus around the table in terms of the Quebec nation. But Mr. Vaillancourt, let's talk about the WTO and rules-based international trade. We often talk about the WTO rules that are in place. Even if an agreement falls by the wayside, the WTO rules. But the rules or dispute settlement mechanism seems to be broken. In March 2020, at this committee, we did a study on that, and nothing has occurred since then. We had our first Trump administration, and then the paradigm remained under the Biden administration. You said it's all well and good to have rules, but not at any price. And some people think that without the WTO, we're absolutely stuffed, and we're left up to the devices of Trump. But what are the possible reforms of the WTO? Well, the WTO has become so weak that there have been multilateral agreements almost to replace the WTO. The problem with the WTO is that if there's it's an organization that includes so many countries, and therefore it's difficult to agree. There was a cycle round that was absolutely terrible failure because the parties couldn't manage to agree. So now the trend is multilateral agreements, and Canada signed 3 giant agreements, CUSMA, CETA, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we have referred to earlier. That's where the current state of affairs is. And we've tried to overcome some of the WTO hurdles in terms of those free trade agreements. For example, the private arbitration tribunals that were rejected in CUSMA, which are dysfunctional in the CETA free trade agreement. They were implemented, but there was no European ratification to actually fully implement them. So there are also bilateral agreements that Canada negotiates. But in terms of state-investor dispute settlement, well, we need civil society to step up to the plate. Question. Well, that mechanism was the subject of a study. It was removed from CUSMA, which originally was NAFTA, and, perhaps Canada's stubbornly signing new agreements, but what should we do?
Short answer, please.
Okay. Oui, on devrait mettre fin à ces accords.
Yes, indeed, we should put an end to those kinds of dispute settlement agreements.
Sharing some time with Mr. Group.
I am. I'm in a sharing mood. Mr. Roy, to your knowledge, has the government challenged the EU's discriminatory treatment of Canadian Canadian pork products?
Nope.
Has the Canadian government, to your knowledge, challenged the discriminatory treatment of Canadian pork products in the United Kingdom?
By not signing it, yes.
Okay. And do you know why the government has not challenged the EU on this?
Well, we have requested more clarity on the EU side. In fact, the industry is going there in the coming weeks to have more clarity, but it's still opaque, and we would like to have more knowledge about what is happening. And we have also advocated this to the government.
Thank you. Would you be willing to share that request to the committee that you made to the government?
Yes.
Thank you. Bet. Thank you. And, Mr. Kingston, one last question for you. Why do you think a unilateral EV tariff is the right way to go with respect to China rather than using our existing trade remedy laws, whether that's an AD, CVD, or a safeguard measure?
Typically, we would support using those mechanisms, but in this situation, Canada had to react extremely quickly to put that tariff in place because of the pressures that were coming from the United States. So it was a unique situation, but we believe it was the right move given the circumstances.
Merci, chers collègues, pour fermer la boucle.
Thank you. Just to tie up the loose ends, Mr. Roy, I'm sure you'll agree with me. Many people would like to live in Beauce, and unfortunately there aren't many of us who actually do get the pleasure of living in the Beauce region. Mr. Roy, earlier you talked about long-term, predictable, foreseeable, more rigid agreements. For example, CETA, you said that the agreement isn't rigorous enough in a sense. Now, could you please explain to us what the actual root causes are? They strike me as being easy to solve if the government would only turn its attention to them. Well, this is kind of technical, so I'll try and sort of give you a macro view. But the European Union requires us to test meat that we export to Europe for a particular parasite that doesn't even exist on our farms. We haven't even seen them in our farms for years and years, but they require this test, which is very costly. And at the end of the day, that prevents us from having real access to that marketplace, because we spend so much money to meet that standard that it becomes impossible to properly access that market. That's one example. Question. Have you brought that issue to the table with the government, What is their take on it? Well, we have raised the issue, and to date, unfortunately, we've got no adequate response which would facilitate access to that marketplace. I see. If I could just now come back quickly to interprovincial trade. Once again, there are a lot of health issues in terms of food security that we're grappling with. If we were to keep our promises and remove interprovincial barriers, this has been pledged by the Liberal government but hasn't been done yet, is there any pan-Canadian health standard that would in the future facilitate interprovincial trade? Am I dreaming in Technicolor, or is it possible? Yes, it is possible. And how would that be achieved? Well, what we've proposed, and we've sent the government documentation in this regard, is to harmonise the rules with the CFIA, because food safety applies in Quebec, in Ontario. It's more or less equivalent across the board from province to province to province. Now, what about red tape? Is it too cumbersome when it comes to food security? For example, Quebec versus Ontario, are they similar? Is it ballpark similar? Is it easy to overcome that issue? Well, you're asking a very pertinent question when it comes to bureaucracy and red tape. I think that we could gain tremendously in efficiency were we to streamline our rules and regulations. We have so many rules, and we could be much more competitive, even domestically, were we to streamline. Well, it's true in Canada. The Liberal government created a lot of red tape, far too much.
Well, all right, on to Ms. Lapointe and Mr. Navki.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about Quebec and Canada. Now, we've talked a lot about harmonising health and safety rules, but when you talked about earlier about provincial slaughterhouses, you talked about the need for harmonisation. Is that something that could be dealt with when it comes to removing tariff and trade barriers between the provinces? And how would you approach that kind of harmonisation? Response: 94% of our pork currently is processed in slaughterhouses that fall under federal jurisdiction. So that's a significant share of our production. These are slaughterhouses under federal jurisdiction, inspected under federal jurisdiction. There are small slaughterhouses that are standardised, and it's a question of consumer trust. Were there to be an issue in a particular province because of unequal standards, and were, for example, for argument's sake, there to be an issue with food safety and food security in one particular province, well, that could have a ripple effect in terms of consumer trust, and we want to avoid that at all costs. So under that mechanism, we need greater harmonisation. The standards need to be reasonable, but we can't have them be too cumbersome either. Thank you very much. You referred to processing, and you said that there was room for value-added products. Could you give us some example of value-added products? Well, fresh produce. We package it and we send it out to the marketplace in short order. It would be possible with Europe if we didn't have to deal with the constraint of this parasite test, because in Europe they require that the produce be frozen, which in fact reduces the quality of the produce and enables the European produce to have the best to be showcased on the shelves of their grocery stores. The same is true in Japan. We can't produce everything that we produced and we send to Japan. Well, that value added is reduced because it has to be frozen. Thank you. Well, I was thinking about meat products, for example, dried meat products. Well, one of our producers and processors in Quebec has got a small market share in Europe in organic produce, and yet it's a very small share. But that processor has a niche spot in the market. It was really difficult to get into, and that they have said that there'd be so many possibilities were the tariff barriers not to exist in the first place. Thank you very much.
In 48 seconds. So first of all, I want to say, as a proud Canadian, I think all regions of this country are beautiful, and so thank you for sharing all your regions with all of us. I'll go back to Mr. Kingston. In fact, Monsieur Roy as well. We're in a very uncertain time. I think, Mr. Kingston, you spoke about around achieving that certainty that is important for business. Canada is really focused not only on the Canada-U.S. part of things, but also in terms of our trade diversification. We still fundamentally believe that rules-based trading system, a liberalized trading system, is a good thing for Canadians and for the Canadian economy. In a very short period of time, from both of your industries' perspective, as we engage in these conversations with U.S. and other parts of the world, what kind of things you would like to see to further strengthen the rules-based trading system so that it can positively impact your particular industries, but most importantly, Canadians? Start with Mr. Kingston.
Sure, yeah. So from an automotive perspective, trade diversification isn't really an option, just given the nature of the industry. We are totally integrated to the U.S., and it wouldn't make sense to build vehicles here necessarily to send to other markets. So the U.S. has to be the priority for auto. And then the key principle that we need to pursue is durability to our trade agreements. The CUSMA, when it was negotiated at the request of the U.S., put in place this review mechanism, and it does create ongoing uncertainty for the industry, because if the U.S. does trigger the withdrawal every single year, for the next 10 years, we will have to go through a review. So anything that can be done to put in long-term certainty into these trade deals is very important for the sector.
Mr. Rock?
Yes.
Very briefly, sir.
It will be brief. The diversification is really important around the world, and also a climate that is good for businesses will be really helpful.
To our witnesses, very much appreciated. I'm quite sure that you will be back before the committee several times in the next couple of years as we meet the challenges and are looking for suggestions from both industries. So thank you very much. I will suspend so that we can go into camera, please, and the witnesses can exit.
you.